Hello and welcome to Professor Pincushion. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can create a slot seam. Now this example right here looks like a normal seam, but if I was to pick it up and give it a little movement, you're going to see a pop of contrasting color underneath. This is really a decorative seam that you can add to any of your projects, and especially garments are nice because you don't have to make any alterations. The seam allowance is exactly the same and I did not have to change that. It's really fun. And it looks really neat, plus it's easy. Let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I need to do is prep the area that I want to have the slot seam. So what I'm going to do that is just treat it like it's a normal seam. For my example, these are going to be my main fabrics and I'm going to have my slot seam in between this area here. So this is going to be the seam between these two pieces. So you're going to take your pieces, place them right side to right side, pin the area where you're going to create the seam, and then you're going to do a basting stitch. The basting stitch is going to be the longest stitch on your machine. Don't worry about doing any back stitching. In fact, you don't want to do a back stitch. And you're going to do this at whatever your required seam allowance is for the pattern that you're using. So I'm going to go ahead for my example and do it at the 5/8 seam allowance. After you finish your seam, go ahead and press that seam open, which you can see I've already done. And this is very important. You definitely want your seam to be pressed open in order for this to work. And then if you wish to after this point, you can go ahead and finish the raw edges of your seam. You can see I've also already done that with an overcast stitch, and we'll go into finishing the edges next. Next, I'm going to prep the fabric that's going to go in between my slot seam. Now, in my example, I'm going to be using a contrasting fabric, but you can use a matching one if you wish. The first thing I need to do is cut out a strip for each area that's going to have a slot seam. So this strip, the length of it should be the exact length of your seam. Then the width of it should be about 1.5 inches. So once you have that cut out, the next thing I like to do is finish all my raw edges, just because it is a thin piece of fabric and I want to make sure that it's not going to fray any more than it has to. For finishing the raw edges, you can really use whatever you prefer. I'm doing an overcast stitch on my machine, but you can definitely just use a regular zigzag stitch as well. Just want to make sure that I do all 4 sides. And it'll just help it look a little bit neater. I mean, this part is optional. I just think it looks nicer. Take your contrasting strip and you're going to place it so it goes right into the middle of the seam line. So the middle of your strip should be in the middle where the seam line is. And you're not going to see any of your seam allowance anymore, so it should be covered by the strip. And you're going to pin this into place. Now when I pin it, I like to pin it so I have my pins on the right side of my seam because I'm going to be looking at the right side when I'm sewing this next part. Next, you're going to take your garment or your project back to your machine and you're going to sew equal distance on either side of the seam line. So here's my seam line. So if I do a 1/4 inch on this side of the seam line, I have to do a 1/4 inch on this side of the seam line too. So you're just starting at the top of the seam line, sewing down to the bottom, and then doing the same thing on the other side. Now the distance between your stitching and your seam line is really up to you. If you want something really subtle, you can do a little bit closer, like 1/8 of an inch from the seam line on both sides. You can do a 1/4 of an inch if you're unsure. That's sort of the middle ground, and you can do even greater than that. The only thing is you can't go greater than what your seam allowance was originally. So I can't do 5/8 since that was what my seam allowance is. It's not going to work because then my raw edge is going to keep popping up when I'm finished. So for this example, I'm going to do a 1/4 inch away from my seam line. So here's my seam line here. I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch on the left side and then a 1/4 inch on the right side. I'll also do 1/8 of an inch example just so you can see the difference. Now I'm using a regular length straight stitch, and don't forget to back stitch at the beginning and end of your seams. Lastly, you're going to grab your seam ripper and you're going to take out our original basting stitch. So you're going to be separating these 2 sides at the seam line. Lying flat on a table, your seam's not really going to look any different, but imagine it if it was on a garment that had shape, if it was part of a bodice or something like that. So if I just take this up, and you can see with movement, you're going to get that peak of color, that contrast that looks really cool. And you can also open these up a little bit more if you want to see more of that. So this is the 1/4 inch that I did. Now let me bring in the 1/8 inch. And we'll just open that up a little bit, add some movement, and then you'll just see a little peak of color. So this is just if you want a hint of it. This is definitely something if you want to see more of it. So you can definitely play with it and get something that you really prefer. New tutorials are released weekly, so please subscribe to be notified of the next release. Make sure to check out our other videos and visit ProfessorPincushion.com to view our complete library with well over 200 sewing video tutorials, including our exclusive premium content. Our premium membership is only $5 a month for unlimited access and only available at ProfessorPincushion.com. Also, don't forget to download our mobile app for videos on the go. Thanks for watching.